The world's largest commercial airliner is coming apart in mid-air. Pilots face an avalanche of warnings.
This is like the simulator exercise from hell.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Flight Blog, this is Captain Ox speaking. Welcome aboard part 2 of our interview with Captain Richard de Crespigny with Qantas Airlines, who on November 4th, 2010, landed his crippled A380 after the number 2 engine exploded. Often both national culture and corporate culture influence a flight crew for better or worse during a crisis. The Asiana in San Francisco comes to mind. What do you believe of your cultural environment contributed to the successful outcome of your flight that day?
I think the Australian culture contributes greatly to the piloting community in Australia. We have descended from convicts that were dispatched from England to Australia, and there's a bit of convict blood in probably most of the Australians, and we're a bit rascal of attitude, and we have a healthy disrespect for authority just by itself. To be respected, you have to be respectable, and leaders need to build respect to be respected, and Australians really don't have much respect for people who have a notional position without any capability. So Australians will always challenge authority, and it's a sort of a great rascal attitude. And what that means is that the Australians will always be happy and very keen and easy to say stop. There's a great story of an Australian pilot, a first officer who went to Asia, and he worked with an airline in Asia, and the captain, who was a European, wanted to take this Boeing out on the runway and take off. And the first officer said, no, we are taking off the wrong way. And the captain said, well, we're going to do it. And the first officer said, we don't have the performance. We're taking off towards mountains and we don't have the performance. And the captain said, well, we're doing it anyway. He was autocratic. So the aircraft lines up, the captain puts his power on and the aircraft doesn't move. And the first officer has got his foot firmly on the brakes. And the aircraft doesn't move. And the captain says, take your foot off the brakes. And the first officer says, change the runway. And the captain did. So at certain times, pilots need to know when they're going to say stop. And it's a gut feeling, and Australians will gladly say stop. So if I'm not confident in my role as a captain in my airline, I'll be told very quickly, and it's right that they tell me so. No one has the right to be an autocratic leader in a high-tech environment where lives are at risk, be it a surgery, an operating table, or an aircraft cockpit. So that's the national culture. The personal culture is that airline pilots, if they have learned the way the industry would like to have them learn CRM, crew resource management. In some airlines, they think that CRM means captain resource management. So some of those airlines still don't get it. But CRM is crew resource management, and that's a trait anyone in the world can learn.
In today's enlightened CRM environment, it takes everybody to fly that airplane safely, and the captain is not just God.
In the Airbus philosophy that you understand, Eric, we have a pilot flying, a pilot non-flying, and the non-pilot flying carries out all the checklists, and he's looking after all the systems, and the pilot flying really has to aviate and then navigate and then communicate. And the captain has to keep a situation awareness. He's got to have spare processing brain power to keep an awareness of all the things going around him. He can't afford to be tunnel vision, because then he's going to lose a situation awareness, maybe lose sight of what's happening to fuel quantity that's slowly decreasing every minute they stay in the air. So the captain must work hard to stay unloaded so that he can command the situation and be on top of it. And so Matt was extraordinarily busy, did a fantastic job, and my job was to try and sit back as much as I could and keep a broad awareness.
Excellent. I have an article in Airways magazine, April edition, chronicling a medical emergency I had, and I emphasize in the story the CRM that goes into it, the communication not only with the flight deck, but the folks in back, and the time limit constraints, and you've got to make fuzzy decisions in limited time, and I couldn't help but notice the analogy here, obviously a far more dramatic and impressive event. You boiled it down to something that students learn from day one: aviate, navigate, communicate.
That's right. Your job is to fly the airplane. When that was what the first reaction was, to level the aircraft and sort out the fact that we were flying. We'd had the auto thrust, it failed. and to stabilise the aircraft, make sure we weren't going to fly into the hills that we were aiming towards. So you aviate first, then navigate, and then communicate. And so we kept that priority the whole time. And it's important that the captain really does keep his mind free. He has to delegate. Now, we had 5 pilots on the crew that day.
All 5 pilots up in the cockpit, the culmination of something like 150 years of experience, and it turned out to be quite auspicious because you had to put all your brains together to get safely down on the ground.
And all 5 pilots were really very, very busy, and we delegated. So the captain has to assign tasks to other people and then let them do their job, not micromanage. If he's micromanaging, that means he's tunnel visioning or focusing on that to the detriment of monitoring the rest of the situation. So you have to delegate, you have to have trust in your people to do their job. The expression is trust but verify, so you can go back and verify every now and then that things are happening. But that's what we were doing. Everyone was busy on the flight deck. We had Matt head down doing ECAMs. I'm head up keeping a global situation awareness. I told Mark, who was the third pilot, I said, Mark, if Matt and I are looking down, then you look up. If we're all looking up, then you look down. You can't afford to have everyone, you just should never have everyone looking at the same thing. The role of a captain is really, it's a leadership role, and it's getting the best out of your team. And it's enabling your team. Your job is to enable the team to do their job. They're all trained, they're all qualified, and so I let them do their jobs, and they did a great job. And so really, again, this is why the story QF32 is so interesting, because of the leadership and the teamwork and the decision making. And there was one thing that I mentioned in the book that I do need to mention here, and that is that when I couldn't guarantee the fuel, I didn't understand the fuel page, and no one else really did. I decided to climb into what we call an Armstrong spiral, named after Neil Armstrong. So, and there's a long history to that, but that's in the book. So I asked air traffic for a climb to 10,000 feet, and we were in 30 miles, so I was setting up to be able to do a glide landing if all the engines failed. My gut feeling was I had to mitigate for the loss of all engines in case we lost them. And all the other pilots, when they thought I was going to climb, called out, "No, stop." And then I came to a decision. I thought, clearly the other pilots don't know what I want to do. And they also thought that if I had pushed the engines up to high thrust, that we would have destroyed more engines, which I think I wasn't planning to do that. But if I had firewalled the engines, I think we would have destroyed 2 more engines. But the point is, I'm really glad they did say no. And it's important that they say no. And when the other pilots in the crew say no, or when someone in any organisation says stop, this is not right, you have to listen to them, because these are perhaps experts in their fields that are saying, no, the space shuttle is not clear to take off on this cold day. Or maybe we shouldn't be drilling oil in the Mexican Gulf using this type of mud mix. So there are people out there who are experts, and when they say stop, probably are giving you good advice, and you have to listen to it. So I was very lucky that they did say stop. And I considered it, I didn't have time to discuss it, so I thought, they're not as worried as I am, so let's continue, and if it gets worse, I will climb later. At that point in time, I deferred to their group mental model and their group experience or expertise, thinking maybe I should listen to them and we'll discuss it at a later time. When they said stop and I didn't climb, that is not a point of failure for any leader. It's actually a point of success for the team. And that's the point. A win in a situation like any aircraft situation is a team win. Failures are because of the captain, because they haven't led it. So it was good that they said stop, and I'm very proud that they did. And you never want to be on an aircraft where people are afraid to say stop.
Very good point. I also like the point you mentioned about delegating to unburden yourself as the captain to maintain that global awareness and focus on the big picture.
Many times the captain might have knowledge that the other crew don't have a knowledge of. Might be time-critical situation. Doesn't have time to tell the other pilots about what he's planning to do. So CRM is great in its time, but sometimes there isn't time, and the captain has to do what his responsibility says, which is to be responsible for the lives of the passengers, and if he has to operate in isolation from the other crew because they don't understand, he has to do it.
Let's do a little bit of analysis about the flight itself. You talked about a control check, And really, it was somewhat unprecedented at the time when you did it. And now you're saying it's being written even into the Airbus procedures.
You do control checks when you're unsure of the aerodynamic capability of the aircraft. There was an El Al flight that had an engine break away from the wing. In fact, 2 engines broke off, the 2 engines off the aircraft, the jumbo. And it was flying happily, and then it made the approach and it crashed in. It rolled over and crashed into the apartment building in Amsterdam. And there are other cases where aircraft have crashed when they've reconfigured and they've slowed on the approach. So we learn from all these experiences, and it's also second nature in any military pilot that if you're hit by a ground fire or if you had air collision when you're flying in formation, that you would prove the aircraft aerodynamically before you come to land. Again, we had lost 65% of our roll control, and we had 3 fuel imbalances that were out of limits that were getting worse with time. And with all the other failures that we had, it certainly threw up question marks as to whether we'd be able to control the aircraft when we came to land. So we had to do a control check. And so every time we would slowed and we'd load the flaps and we'd load the landing gear and we slowed the aircraft, we did about 5 control checks each time the aircraft slowed and reconfigured. And every time we rolled to the right, Matt later told me, and it's in my book, that the aircraft started to shake when we put any right aileron in. And I think that's because there was massive damage to the left-hand wing. And aerodynamically, if you have damage to the left-hand wing, it must be also manually put in with flight controls to the right-hand wing. The damage is doubled if the aircraft is to fly straight. So we had a lot of aerodynamic damage, and we had flight control damage. And it didn't really like turning to the right at all, but we did a dress rehearsal of the landing at 4,000 feet at a safe altitude, and if the aircraft had departed or started to depart, you would know that your last selection was unwise and we should bring it back. You want it to be back to full certification standard. You would increase your speed 1.23 times that speed where you lose it. We didn't have the capability to do that. If we'd sped up 3 knots, we would have run off the runway. But my point is that if you understand how aircraft are certified and the margins for certification, then doing a control check becomes a whole lot easier, because to some degree you're approaching some of the philosophies that the test pilots use in finding the limiting cases and then adding appropriate margins. You also have to look at whether the flight controls are saturated, which means that they can't move any more. And the flight controls were approaching saturation. So we knew exactly what X flight control we had, and it wasn't that much.
That's amazing. And obviously you were between a rock and a hard place on the landing itself.
The flaps weren't damaged at all. So we landed at flaps 3. That's what the system came up with. I'm presuming to give us the go-around capability, but we have no leading edge slats. Loss of the aileron to droop 5 degrees and give you a lift function, but our ailerons weren't even flaring. The ailerons were sticking up full scale deflect 18 degrees up. The loss of the boundary layer because of all the damage to the leading edge of the wing. We had a hole in the wing, the air was venting through, but it was the rest rehearsal, it was the control checks that proved our aircraft safe. So when we made the approach, we got to speed and stall warning, we startled, we didn't panic, didn't go back, we continued to land.
Excellent. That brings us full circle back to the beginning of our discussion, where we talk about the captain has to make fuzzy decisions with imperfect information and do that on a continuing basis going 10 miles a minute. Again, it's Captain Richard de Crepigny here, author of QF-32 and captain of the Airbus A380 QF-32 on that fateful day. Here's a quick teaser of part 3, where Captain de Crepigny talks about going beyond CRM, his projects, and advice for upcoming pilots.
The problem is that the aircraft's getting more complex. Pilots are getting less hands-on experience. They're getting isolated from their machines. Imagine being a pianist going to do a concert and you haven't practiced for a month. You can't do it. So when the pilot is in an aircraft and the automation fails, if he hasn't a hands-on experience, he's like the pianist being at a concert, or Tiger Woods going out without practicing for the last month. It doesn't work.
Coming soon on CaptainOx.com. This is Captain Ox, signing off.